Hey guys, I really hope you enjoyed this clip, but before you do, please hit subscribe. I just kind of want to start with, I think, what a lot of your persona on Twitter is, and a lot of what you go by triple net income on Twitter.
Yes.
So let's just start with that kind of world. How did you get into it? And then we're just going to start breaking it down a little bit.
Yeah. My grandfather is for sure my largest business mentor, and he was an oil and gas landman. And so he bought mineral interest all over the place throughout the kind of Uinta Basin, so the eastern side of Utah into the Colorado side, up into Wyoming, and then started working down on the New Mexico side of the Permian. And then it was about in the 70s, he diversified and started building single tenant Texacos on build-to-suits. And he built a handful of those. And then following those, he started building RBs. And so as I grew into the business, my dad was a shopping center developer for Albertsons primarily and throughout the Intermountain area. And so I kind of grew up hearing about it around the dinner table. And I knew I wanted to be a real estate owner from a young age. And so a lot of my path was just trying to pick the best path to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So I started as a tenant rep broker in 2002, because at that time, that was the best mentor we could find for me to go work for in the marketplace. I was working for two agents in Salt Lake that were leaders of the industry, and I was handed off clients like Starbucks and Wells Fargo and Wendy's, and my job was to go find more locations for them.
Okay, so essentially you're a site selection guy.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
How would you define a great site selection person? Like, what goes into that?
To this day, I can tell you I have sat at just about every single intersection in Salt Lake County for at least 20 minutes, sitting at the intersection, counting cars, trying to figure out which is the more AM traffic heavy side of the road. That's a Starbucks exercise, right? Trying to figure out which side of the road just gets more traffic in the morning. So you can do that at morning or at night, right?
Okay.
Obviously, whatever you count at night is inverse. And so you just sit there. So hands-on. I think hands-on is the answer to that.
So what do you look for Arby's? How many lifted trucks drive by this side of the road?
It's definitely a correlation with beef and cheddars and truck nuts, right? Yeah. Arby's a little harder. That's a harder customer to pin down, and it's shifted a lot for them over the last 20 years. I think it's probably easier if you stick to a brand that's more something that's been focused over the last couple of decades. It's much easier to find a Dutch Bros, for example, than it is to find an Arby's.
We're talking about Dutch Bros. We'll get there in a second. Do most people come to you and say, okay, we want to do 10 Dutch Bros or 10 Wells Fargos in Salt Lake City, go find us the sites? Or are you out looking for sites knowing, hey, this is something Wells Fargo might like, I'll call them?
Yeah, I think there's a perception with a lot of the younger people that are coming into the commercial real estate or just newer people into the industry that they often think that at some point this big switch flips and then everybody just calls you and says, hey, can you go handle this for me? At the end of the day, it's just like the site selection thing. You have to be relevant. You have to be present. It's hands-on. And I find if you're in the path of growth and if you're tying up dirt and you're starting to work on conceptual site plans and then you're putting it in front of customers, there's more of the back and forth where the customer might say, hey, this doesn't work for me here, but I'd like to go down to this intersection. But it's not so much that you're sitting back in a chair just waiting for the inbound call. You have to be out in front of it.
How do you determine, like, from your perspective, what would be a tenant that you want to work with? What do they need to, what are the characteristics of a tenant that you like working with?
Excellent question. For me, you have to find back end. So you have to be able to sell the asset on the back end or put a long-term loan in place.
Okay.
That is a favorable financing.
Okay.
So, and I think maybe what I mean by that is we've been tempted and we've looked at over the years at a number of like daycare deals on build-to-suits, and they're interesting. They're much harder to finance on the back end.
Okay.
When COVID hit, I mean, that asset class became toxic basically overnight, right?
Yep.
It's much easier to finance something like a household name that's a fast food drive-through restaurant or an auto parts store or something along those lines.
And then like a Starbucks is easy as it's like Amazon, basically.
That's correct.
It's almost like the government. It's as good as a government bond or something.
I think once a tenant has 100 units, so on these larger franchise deals, if they have 100 restaurants under their belt or they're public and corporate, a corporate tenant with a publicly traded ticker, it's the same thing. They're the same size at that point. Once they get to 100 stores, they have a CFO, they have a CEO, they have an asset management team. They look and behave exactly like a company does. It's much larger.
And do most companies that get to 100 units, did they usually do that on their corporate balance sheet to get there? Or are there certain developers that'll take a risk on them at 20, 30, 40 units and help them grow to 100?
It typically that you do see developers building for them well in advance of them being at 100 units.
Okay.
And the private equity side of things has really changed the game over this last cycle. Let's call it since 2010 to now.
Okay.
And the private equity companies now are getting involved with brands at 20 to 30 units. And so once the private equity company has bought them, it's not like their balance sheet becomes much better, right? I mean, they still are dealing with 20 or 30 units, right? And truth of the matter is, you look at a lot of these 100 store operators right now, and some of their balance sheets are a little rough looking at the exact moment right now.
Yeah.
So it's just expensive to build stores. It's expensive to grow. It's expensive to gain new customers. And so a lot of these PE companies have started stepping in much earlier. Once a good PE company's behind something, we'll take a hard look at it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just talk about that for a second. So you kind of described like what a great tenant would look like, but I'm sure everybody would like to develop for Dutch Bros or Starbucks or Wells Fargo. How do you actually get into bed with these folks? How do you meet them?
Yeah. You just find the site. You find a site they need.
Okay.
And that is really, it's just a 101 thing. You got to think through who their customer is and who their best stores are. And then it's finding the right site and the right spot. And most brands, once they get to call it several hundred stores or larger, are usually pretty apprehensive about a rookie developer building for them. They get a little nervous about that. So some of them will ground lease, and that's an easy way for you to get your foot in the door. If they won't ground lease and they insist on you building a building for them, then typically, if you have the right site, they'll work with you no matter what happens and no matter what the deal structure is.
Oh, okay. So what do you mean that they'll ground lease? That means that you might find the site, but they don't trust you to build it. So they'll just ground lease it, build it on their own.
Yeah, don't trust, or the market cycle is just more advantageous for them to build their building. So like right now, for example, we just completed a Quick Quack just opened on a pad that we delivered the pad for them. And then they built their own building. They ground lease from us. Jack in the Box is going to open within a few months on the adjacent pad. And they chose to build their own building as well.
Okay, I'm Chris. I just showed up to ICSC. I'm fresh out of college, or maybe not even fresh out of college, but I'm just looking to get an in at Starbucks or at Dutch Bros. Like, how do you build relationships with these people? Is it just cold calling them? Hey, I have a great site. They end up liking it and they're kind of forced to know you, or are there better ways that you've built relationships with these people?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's just a human that is making the decision there at Dutch Bros.
Not a bot.
No, it's not a bot, and it's not somebody in a boardroom. I mean, let's take Dutch Bros. That's a great one for example. It's a human that is a pretty easy human to talk to. The culture at Dutch Bros is that it filters all the way from the broistas out in the parking lot taking your order all the way up to the corporate level. They're the same type of personality all the way through. So they're pretty easy people and approachable to talk to.
Yeah.
And they each have a booth. Each of these retailers has a booth. And so you can go meet with them and you can talk to them. We had 4 rookies at this year's ICSC event. And 2 of our rookies met the chief development officer for Planet Fitness. And they met because they won a contest that Planet Fitness was doing where they were sponsoring something and giving away some Planet Fitness swag. And, they freaked out and got excited because they won something. And next thing you know, chief development officer's out introducing himself, saying hello.
That's awesome. How does the relation, and again, it's just building a relationship, but clearly you have to have the chops. So it's one thing if I bring Dutch Bros one site, but how do you go from being, I brought you one site to I'm your preferred person? And like, what do you have to have done to kind of get there?
Yeah, I don't have that status with Dutch Bros. I tweet about Dutch a lot and we have a number of deals going with them, but I'm not their preferred developer in any of their markets. I would like that. So if you figure that out, let me know.
Okay.
Yeah. I've just continued to put the right sites in front of them that I think they would say yes to. And I think if you stay on it with any of these retailers, the process for them has become much more difficult over the last year and a half. As soon as interest rates started moving the cap rates, the back end exit values moved for these tenants as well. And what that meant is that any developer that was not well heeled and that was not ready for a little bit of a blip to go through the marketplace instantly had more trouble financing the deal, putting the deal together, building the deal, selling the deal, everything. And the translation there on the ground is that if you are a real estate manager and your area to expand in was Salt Lake City and you had 12 stores earmarked to open in 2023, as we were going into the fall of 2022, you at least had 3 or 4 developers call you and say, I'm not starting this project.
Right.
So now you have to go back and report to your boss and say, hey, instead of 12 openings, I'm going to have 8 or I'm going to have 9. And so you could imagine what the ripple effect is as you go through the whole country. And so one of the things I think anybody can present to any retailer today is just a clear path that they're actually going to get the job done.
Yep. And then if you take like Dutch Bros, but some of these stores that are maybe like have a more specialty build out. Dutch Bros is like I go to Dutch Bros all the time, by the way.
Yeah. What's your drink?
I get a nitro cold brew.
Okay.
I'm like I don't get the like dressed up milkshake type stuff. But when I always go to them, I'm like, man, you look at what they sell for online. It's like this little 800 square foot or 1,000 square foot box, huge piece of land because they've got double drive-throughs and everything. But then you might go to we're going to talk about the conversion to Olive Garden in a little bit, but then you go to some buildings that are like 4,000 or 5,000 feet, maybe a lot more multi-dimensional. More tenants might fit in there if Olive Garden goes bust, which they never will because they offer great breadsticks at a fair value. How should one look at buying a Dutch Bros versus a company with a building that is maybe you could see more potential tenants occupying that building?
Yeah, the most versatile building in the drive-through world right now is probably a 3,000 foot drive-through.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about that is if you rewound the clock maybe 10 years, the most versatile building would be a 3,500 foot building.
Okay.
And if you go another 10 years back, it would have been a 4,000 foot building.
Okay.
Kitchen sizes have become much more efficient.
Okay.
And there's also just far less food being actually cooked on site. And so much of the food that's prepared through our drive-throughs these days is going through a commissary.
Okay.
And it arrives at the restaurant. And so it's really kind of a version of a lot of warming and then some cooking. So what's interesting about that is the size just continues to shrink. It's not going up. In fact, a lot of the new fast food that's going in right now is shrunk down to 2,200 feet, which is a totally small size for what it used to be. Customers aren't sitting in the dining room as much as they used to. So drive-through percentage of sales is much higher than it was, and that trend continues to move upward. So it's hard to weigh in specifically unless you're looking at just a building size and looking at other tenants that might go in there. But at the moment, 3,000 feet is a versatile size. The other reason I like 3,000 foot buildings is because they fit on 3/4 of an acre to an acre sites. That site size hasn't changed. So over 20 years, that site size has been the same thing.
Johnny, do you go sit in these places? I feel like I grew up, my grandparents would like take me to McDonald's, throw me in the jungle gym with the nasty balls that had just been caked by thousands of kids, probably puking on them. And I just lived in those balls.
Gross.
That's kind of over, isn't it? Like nobody's building jungle gyms inside their units anymore. Yeah,
that's correct. It's very infrequent that you see that. And what's interesting is the concepts that you're seeing more diners sit in are more of like a Chick-fil-A or a Culver's, and it's almost like more of an experiential fast food environment. But just the normal kind of middle of the fairway fast food retailers like a Burger King, Wendy's, McDonald's, just less customers are sitting in the lobbies.
Yeah. I want to just take a step back for a second. So we talked about site selection. So traffic probably matters. You just said something interesting about if you're doing a 3,000 foot building, you like it because it works on 3/4 of an acre. Is there anything else like site related that matters? Obviously zoning, you got to have it zoned, but typically frontage on a major retail, it's probably already zoned what you want.
Yeah, every drive-through user is worried about one thing when they look at a site.
Okay.
How do my customers get into the drive-through?
Okay.
That is the number one thing, every single one of them, every flag, every brand, they're all thinking the same thing. How do my customers get into this drive-through? Ingress is the most important feature of any site.
Okay, so can you go a little deeper on that? Is there something that you could pick up just by looking at a vacant land site to think, they're going to hate this. There's no way the people can get in, or is it always, hey, we can figure out a way to get them in?
A common thing that you see all the time on a larger highway site or some kind of state road scenario is you see a raised median. So what that means is you only have a right in, right out. So all of a sudden that site is dinged versus if it had a full access, if you could make a left in. So that's a big change for retailers. That's one thing to look at right away. And then another question is, most of the astute retailers will then ask the question of, are there plans to add raised medians in the future? So some of that is being spent upfront with the DOT that you're working in, and just sitting down with them and saying, what are your future plans for this intersection and the city? Sitting at a corner is always an advantage to sitting mid-block. And if you are mid-block, or if you're 2 or 3 or 4 pads off the corner, can I get access to the corner? Cross access is always a better thing than no cross access. So
what's cross access?
When you're as a developer, when I'm able to get a legal right to cross the other property, so I have access to additional ingress egress points.
So you might be building a Burger King, and I can cross Panda Express, Krispy Kremes, and Arby's to get to my Burger King.
Yeah,
because God knows that's like everywhere.
Yeah, and what's interesting is how much time in our lives, and I tweeted about this yesterday, but everybody thinks development is putting buildings up super fast and it's so fun and, it's amazing. And the sad reality is it's reading, 100-page document after 100-page document.
Yeah.
And cross-access easements are a great example of that. When you show up and you see a pad, if the seller of the land doesn't already have a cross-access in place, and let's just say it was a CVS on the corner, and then there was a Panda Express, to use your example, and then a multi-tenant building, but there was no cross-access to your fourth pad. Getting that cross access might be the hardest part of the entire development process.
And real quick, go back. What is a raised median again?
Raised median is when there's just an actual curb sitting in the middle of the road where you cannot cross it.
I gotcha.
I forget, we're in Texas. So like your trucks, you guys just drive over everything. You're fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, those are like ramps.
Yeah, right.
We just play off those.
To jump. Yeah. No. So it's, that's intimidating for cars. And some trucks, and depending on what it is, sometimes they'll actually do a 6-inch like actual gutter, right, and a curb into and have a gutter there into a median.
Yeah, it's either like a lifted truck, or you might see a cowboy just on his horse, just flying down the center median.
Love that.
Like you'll see often, Walgreens might be across the street from CVS, or is there any time, like if Chick-fil-A is going somewhere in their lease, are they usually putting, hey, we don't want a chicken store anywhere else in this development? Or like what type of competition hurdles do some of these tenants put up, if any?
Yeah, I think this is the number one sale point by why you would do industrial, is because you don't have to deal with any of this.
Yeah.
Exclusive use provisions are probably one of the more challenging parts of a shopping center development. And I just define shopping center as not necessarily like a traditional anchor without parcels out in front of it. Think of a shopping center as anything more than one pad. So we have 2 pads or more. And so that could be a grocery anchored shopping center. It could be just a 3 or 4 pad development. It is so brutal because a lot of these tenants will restrict 5 different uses. For example, McDonald's restricts smoothies. And I know that McDonald's does sell smoothies, but at the same time, are they really a competitor to Tropical Smoothie? Are you going to choose to go to Tropical Smoothie or McDonald's if you're going to get a smoothie? And I just don't think that's the case. I think it's a different customer pattern. So you have to be really careful when you're doing multiple pads in a shopping center or multiple properties in any shopping center environment to make sure that you're defining your exclusive use so that your tenant can run a very successful business plan, but at the same time so that you can work through the remainder of your acreage.
All right, you've done a lot of these deals. I know every company probably has their own little provisions in the lease, but there's probably things you did in the first couple deals that you don't do now. Like, is there anything that comes to mind when I say, like, here are some best practices for how to structure these leases so that they are more, maybe not more favorable, but at least protect the landlord maybe more than like a novice might do on their first deal?
Yeah. Strip mall guy tweets all the time about how he hates options. And I 100% completely concur with his opinion. Options are literally one of the most painful parts of the business, I think. What's also interesting is I'm mostly building single tenant. And so often my primary term is 10 years or 15 or 20 years. And then the tenants will ask for 2 to 4, sometimes 6, 5-year option periods. And a 5-year option period is really just worthless. I mean, my debt has usually rolled. So typically you're going to finance your property and it's going to roll, your debt is going to roll when the primary lease term is up. And so then as you roll into 5-year option periods, you have nothing. You can't really have, there's not much to refinance. There's not much from a collateral standpoint from the bank's perspective. And so you definitely get dinged as far as loan proceeds go when you roll through those 5-year option periods. We have done a number of renewals recently where it's, a 20-year term, and then we'll provide 2 10-year option periods because that gets you a little bit more time. So that's been one of the clauses we like to use. We spend a lot of time and energy making sure that it's a absolute net lease. So this is an interesting thing because there's so many different definitions of what that means on retail. When I say absolute net, I'm trying to pass through every single cost to the tenant and have no management obligation whatsoever if it's single tenant. If it's multi-tenant, I want to have a full recapture of all of my management to actually run a shopping center. I'm not trying to turn my management into a profit center. I'm just trying to make sure I can cover cost and run it efficiently.